I'm Natana.
And I'm Jess.
And this is our podcast.
Wait, what are we doing again?
Well, we'll be diving into how the hairiest and most complicated problems in the world can be traced to the most mundane beginnings. To see if maybe we're not so fucked after all, and maybe there's something we can do about it.
Oh, is that all?
Yes.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Okay, I'm just gonna say it. I'm feeling a bit hopeless.
How so?
You as your own person, you try and show up in your way. Like you're showing up in integrity. You're trying to do the right thing. You're trying to really set the bar to be the change that you want to see.
Mm-hmm.
And then you end up in situations with other people, like social situations, maybe professional situations, whatever it is. And people show up in a completely different way and they accept a completely different standard that you can see is like hella toxic for you. And you're just, a part of you feels like, how can we get progress? How can we make progress? If there are people if I'm surrounded by so many people in the world that think that this is okay, that thinks that this behavior is all right, you know, that don't care to the extent that I do. It kind of sometimes feels a bit hopeless in a sense where it's like, oh my God, like, how do you, like, it's one thing to fight against the system. It's one thing to fight against, like, the big man, a corporation or whatever it is. But when you see that most people are really happy with where they're at and how they're living and all that kind of stuff, you kind of think two things. One, who are you to disrupt that? Like, who are you to suddenly bring in how you want to live or how you think things should be? And then the other part is you feel that it almost limits the impact you can make in the world, where it's like, damn, like if people, like it's kind of like, all right, well, who am I to change the way that they show up, their existence? And then at the same time, it's like, well, the way that they're showing up in their existence, is that actually watering down the effect that I could have? Like, how can I instigate this change in the world when people are so happy with the opposite and they see nothing wrong?
Well, it's interesting because it's how do you evaluate that? You know, for me, if I think it works for them, if it works for them, then fine. Unless proven otherwise that it doesn't work for them, then they'd have no reason to seek out that change. They'd have no reason to change it. It's only when there's a perceived problem that people find the answers they need in order to change.
Yeah.
And then they can choose that. The people, I guess, I think about the people that we can change are people like us that don't necessarily have all the tools or the information, or they're not quite in the same space. You know, we've somehow got new information, new strategies, new perspectives to offer them, and they are seeking those solutions. They want solutions to these problems. That's how I think. It's like, otherwise we're just evaluating, we're basically saying subconsciously that our standards are better than this.
Yeah.
You know, like,
yeah.
It's like we've got a judgment. It's interesting because like we've got a judgment on how other people live their life because we couldn't stand living that life. Like we don't understand how people could live a certain dynamic, a certain life because it would not work for us.
Yeah, or we see on top of that, like, yes, and we see that this is perpetuating a big problem, and we see how that affects, and we see how certain behaviors that other people are okay with are actually perpetuating this big problem that's causing like real damage in the world.
The point that I'm curious about is how do you think that changes your outlook, or how does that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I remember my main point. Okay, so basically, when you're showing up in your way, like you're trying to lead, yeah, with empathy, compassion, all this kind of stuff, you're trying to help build a world based on that, but you're met with situations in which you're not even getting that. In fact, the fact that you're showing up that way it's actually causing you pain in a sense, because you're like, oh my God, what? They believe the opposite of that? Like, how could that be? How could they be so far removed from that? You start questioning if the change that you're working towards is even a welcome change. You start questioning as to like, oh, I can see how this could help society in this and this way, and how I could get rid of conflict in this and this way. But then when you're met with the opposite, you're just like, well, do people even want that? Is there even a point to me trying to make a change, to even just show up differently and give the world more empathy and compassion and self-awareness in the way that I wish was given to me?
Mm-hmm.
What's the point if that's not even being seen, appreciated, and you're actually finding that you standing up to those values is actually creating not only conflict, but it's actually causing damage to the other person?
How do you think that type of conflict is getting you closer to creating the kind of change that you want? Because I remember you saying, like, I'm glad this happened.
Yeah.
I don't see this stopping you from creating the change. It may make you
I felt discouraged.
discouraged momentarily.
Yeah. But I feel like that's where the fatigue happens, because I find a lot of it's one thing that's like kind of fucked up about the world, where it's like, fuck, like I'm trying to save the world. You could even apply this to conservation, or anything like that, any kind of big change in the way that we're comfortable doing things, and you're literally trying to save the world from like not dying. It kind of feels like when you have all this resistance, you're met with all this resistance. It's like, well, what's the point of this? Like, I'm doing this for them. I'm doing this so that we can live longer. I'm doing this so that it's a better place. Like, why am I even bothering if there's so much resistance to it and they really don't like it and they don't see the value? Like, it feels like it makes you question not whether it's worth it, because it's worth it, but it kind of makes you tired. It's just like, well, if no one fucking cares, what's the point? Am I just causing more damage to people? And the reason why I was grateful that it happened later, although like it still is fresh and painful, and I wish I didn't have to go through that. I wish,
But you asked for it.
I asked for it, yes.
You asked to meet your match, to meet people at your level, that you're welcoming people in at your level. And then a conflict happened to make room for that, which really in my head goes, conflict in this case and in many cases is leading you to create the change that you want to create. Even if momentarily you question it and you feel momentarily jaded by it.
So when I meet conflict, when any kind of like change maker meets conflict, they shouldn't see that as a thing that shows why their efforts might not be worthwhile, but rather, like, instead of judging it based on how welcome their efforts are, they should see it as like, by creating this Like this conflict that is arising is a byproduct of change, and it's showing that like you're kind of rustling up. It's like playing around in muddied water. It's like if all the sediment, if all the dirt's in the bottom and you're like mixing things up, of course it's gonna muddy it and it's gonna become cloudy. So that's kind of what conflict is. And it means that you're doing something. It's actually evidence. It's evidence that you're making progress, and it's actually an encouragement rather than an obstacle, or rather than a thing that's like showing you whether you're on the right path or not. In fact, it's showing the byproduct of action. Yeah, is that what you're saying?
Yes. And in a way, it's interesting because on another level, it's showing you, is this problem worth solving? And it's also beating out of you some level of fantasy.
Continue.
To make you a better leader, to make you the capable leader you need to be in order to create the change that you want to create. Because as visionaries and people who want to change the world, I would say we are more inherently optimistic.
Yes.
More inherently optimistic. And like we want to create a version of the world that is better than it is today. In that, one can become a little bit more idealistic. In that, in order for the world to be, or in order for it to be worthwhile, it needs to be exactly the way I see it. Right? When it comes to change is actually can take time. Like there's a way that change is created. It's, momentum needs to be built, and it can take a while to change minds. It doesn't happen overnight, and real important change takes some time. And it's been happening in many, many ways. And it's not like we're starting from the start of this change. And to think that opposition is a setback, as opposition means no one wants this. It's like, no, many, many people want this. But is this the challenge that you are? Because there's going to be challenges left, right, and center, no matter what change it is that you want to create. There's going to be resistance. That's the nature of humans. But are you a capable enough leader? Are you passionate about this? Do you believe in this enough to be the leader it takes to sustain the time it's going to take to make that sustainable change?
Yes. Because it isn't about it being welcomed with open arms. That's not how change works.
And it's not a metric of whether it's worth doing. In terms of like, oh, that person rejected it, or that person doesn't want the change, so is it worth doing?
They don't see the value. They think that I'm standing up for the wrong thing.
They're not the smallest viable audience. That's all that's telling you. They're not where the change starts. They're one of the last dominoes to fall.
So getting not a reaction, but if conflict comes up, it's actually showing that the seeds of change are starting. Like that's step one. If you get a reaction from someone, it means that you've rustled something up in them. You've activated like some kind of emotional response where they feel that a backlash is necessary. So that's actually showing that you touched something in them.
Yeah.
And that's how change starts, is by first you need to activate people. And the first step of that is their defense mechanisms and them wanting to completely confirm that what they're doing is the right thing and how they see the world is the right way and all that kind of stuff. So if someone's being defensive, it's actually a sign that you're doing a good job.
Yeah, it is a sign that you're doing a good job. And ironically, taking a challenge as a setback, it's ironic because if there wasn't resistance, then there would be no problem to solve. Like if it's that easy to create change, this issue isn't that important. All you have to do is have a conversation, everyone agrees with it. Well, okay, that's not actually a problem then, because everyone's changed. So it's actually ironic to go, oh, there's no point in me trying to make this change because there's resistance. Like, there's resistance, and that shows you that someone needs to help make this change.
Yeah.
You know, it's reflecting back to you that there's a problem worth solving.
I really love that reframe. I really, really love it, because I find that that's such a big thing, like feeling discouraged, feeling tired, getting all this resistance, all that. And it's like, well, where's the validation coming from? Like, there's only you can only go so far fueling yourself. And I guess that's why community is so important. That's why finding people that believe in the same vision of the world as you is so important, because it's those people that you should be looking at to work out whether you're on the right path or not, rather than the people that you're instigating a reactive response from them. Yes. Because that's the whole thing. It's like this metric of how do we, when, like you said, change takes time. Change is the long game. So when you're a game changer, when you're a visionary, what are then the markers? Like, how do you see when you're on, how do you mark how close are you, what's happening and all that to actually instigating the thing that you want? And then also the other question is, how do you work out whether you're on the right path and whether your efforts are paying off? Or whether maybe you're on the wrong path and you need to reassess how you're doing things. Because that's when people kind of like look out to others to see how they respond to them. And then based on the agreement, they find it encouraging. And like those are the metrics that they use. So if we're saying conflict is one of those metrics, what would be other things?
So I would say that there needs to be someone who wants what you've got. There needs to be someone. So if, you know, the way you want to change the world is attracting certain people to you, and naturally people are engaged with certain ideas, if you are meeting people along the line that eventually are engaged with it, I would say that is a good indicator. But sometimes you need to implement those ideas for people to realize that that's what they needed all along. So if it's not at ideation stage, if at ideation stage people are like, not so sure, or people aren't open to it, it could be either it's before their time, or they can't imagine themselves needing that, or they don't see the point, right? Maybe they're jaded, right? It then takes, I guess, an implementation or people to practice what you're trying to, like the framework that you're trying to impart, right?
So, yes.
To have evidence of the results that you're trying to get.
In design, there's this idea, especially in graphic design, there's this idea that if you want to show your design work, it's better to show it in context. You designed a billboard, show that billboard on the street. Because when it's out of context, people, just their brains, they don't appreciate it as much. So you're basically saying, well, put it in context. You know, so like for example, my big change that I want to do is I want to help create a world where our systems are designed to put human capital before cash capital, which is big, audacious. A small, like putting that in context would be me saying, well, in that kind of world, when you go to work at your 9-to-5 job, you will come back home feeling more energized. You will go to...
It won't be 9 to 5.
It won't be 9 to 5. Exactly. You will come back home more inspired and more energized than when you went to work to begin with. You will grow personally, not just professionally. going to work will be the same, like going to work and self-development and stuff like that will not be separate. In fact, self-development will be part of going to work.
Mm-hmm.
Going to work adds to your life instead of the weekends adding to your life. Like that's that idea put into context.
Yep. Like now you're speaking people's values, people have emotional connection, you're way more likely to get people on board. And it also shows that there's a big enough problem that people are attracted to the desire of that vision.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas if you then depicted that vision in context and people were like, nah. If everyone was like, no, I don't need
I love
that.
my job the way exactly that it is. I love being really tired and I love living for my weekends. It's the best.
But you already know because you've concocted this vision based on what hasn't worked for you and what you can see is not working in the world around you.
And even
like
looking at pop culture and even memes, like, you know, they speak such truth. As visionaries, as game changers, change makers, I kind of want to like include everyone. So that's why I'm like always listing all of them. But I find that you can see so clearly the big idea. Like you're so good at zooming out and seeing how everything's connected and knowing what's the change that you need to do. The thing is, like, your brain functions slightly differently to people who aren't inherently abstract thinkers. So that's why the context is super important. You need to make your vision accessible. It's an accessibility problem. If people don't understand what you're saying, if people aren't connecting to what you're saying, it's usually an accessibility problem. And that's where context is important. Work out what's the context specific to that person and then speak to how your vision would play out in the context that they know. And then what you're doing is turning a big idea and finally making it digestible in the smallest kind of way, very specific to that person. I think that helps. Like, that's a really good way of getting feedback and testing things out, as opposed to just sharing the grand vision.
Yeah, because otherwise it's just about what you want.
Yeah.
Right? It's not necessarily like you're not, like, it's an act of compassion and empathy and care to take a great vision and communicate it in a way that it applies to other people's values and that they're going to, you know, therefore get value from it.
And that requires a level of empathy and understanding, like being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes and listen to them enough to know how to contextualize it for them and to have different contexts and all that. Because you're so right. When you talk about change, the big change, you're just describing your pain point to them. You're actually describing your context to them.
Especially because this system has been set up in a way that it does benefit some people.
Yeah.
And everyone who's playing a part benefits somehow, even if it's at a larger detriment, right? And so part of that change, to create that change, you need to be able to convince people that a different possibility is possible, even though they never thought it would be, that they've just accepted their current reality as is. And also that there will be more pain to continue down that path than the pain of change, even if there's potential for something better.
Yeah, you're actually making it less risky for them. Because when you can hold on to the gains, when you can grasp the gains properly, then it's easier to embrace the change because you know what you're aiming for. But when the gains are really abstract, it's really hard to grasp onto anything. So of course, as humans, you want to stick to what's already graspable.
Yes.
What you already have here.
Because practically, change is very easy to make. Like, things like structural change, like the actions required to make those changes is easy.
Yeah.
But you're not working with practicality, you're working with people.
You're working with people and their resistance. You're working with their emotions, actually.
Their psychology, their emotions.
That's why, yeah. Because the act itself is easy.
Yeah. And you could see how quickly, we all acted during the pandemic. How quickly, governments have acted to change certain things, to get homeless people off the street, for example. It's very easy when everyone's at risk or there is a larger threat at, it's about priorities, it's about values, it's about...
It's that reframe. It reframed it just enough where now homeless people, like take that example, instead of being seen as homeless people with all this emotional baggage attached to it of like, oh, it's because of X, Y, Z, they've done this to themselves, blah, blah, blah. Suddenly, when you have something like a pandemic, it's like it's a people problem, and you kind of get people in their head to change the schema, to change the idea that's attached to homeless people, for example, where it's like, no, they're not homeless, they're people. And now suddenly with that change of the reframe, it's like, okay, we have places for them, get them off the streets, cool. So it's crazy. Yeah, it is all about mental constructs. So everyone talks a lot about mindset, and I think that mental constructs are different to mindsets.
Okay, do tell, do elaborate.
So, for example...
It just clicked for me what you were saying.
Yeah. Because with change, like you're saying, it's not that the act itself is easy. It's about emotions, people's mental constructs, all of that. It's not about their mentality. It's about...
Whether they're like positive mindset, it's like... No,
that's irrelevant.
Yeah.
That's irrelevant. It's about the other thing.
The constructs.
The constructs.
Mental constructs,
Yes.
yeah.
Oh my God, I forgot the word for a second. I was like, blah, blah, blah. It's about mental constructs. Mm-hmm. So when you can speak in mental construct languages, that's actually when you could really break through. You need to make that construct accessible to that person. Like you need to, and the problem with speaking in mental constructs is that you don't know what the other person's mental constructs are.
You can only find out by their response.
Exactly.
It's where their belief systems, their mindset,
their history,
like,
relationships, mental...
It all comes out, yeah.
It all creates this mental construct, yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's so tricky. And I think that's why it kind of goes back to a point that we made in one of our other episodes about like approaching things with curiosity. Like when you want someone, when you're trying to work out how to have questions and like address those micro problematic... Remember that one that we're talking about? Do you remember the episode I'm talking about?
You'll need to elaborate a little bit.
Remember that episode where you were talking about the sexist comments and like the micro comments where it's like, it's not a big deal, but those things add up and we need to call it early so it doesn't reach the threshold.
Sure.
And we came up with a framework of how to do that. Mm-hmm. And the first step was approaching them with curiosity so that they're open and they're not defensive, and you can start understanding them more so that they can understand your perspective. Mm-hmm. So I think that comes back to this point that we're making, where if the way to create change is through mental constructs rather than convincing anyone or debates or facts or anything like that, those are ways to access other people's mental constructs. People see facts and it helps them access it, but whether they integrate it and actually embody it and change their actions, that's back onto the emotional part of the mental constructs, the follow-through part. Yeah.
Yep.
So you can be hella convincing, but at the end of the day, if you don't change the person's mental construct, if you don't speak to their mental construct, you're not going to get any real change that happens. You're not going to activate anything in them. Mm-hmm. But you need that first step of curiosity about them to be able to see that mental construct. And then it's only then that you can contextualize the change that you want to make so that it then fits. It's almost like puzzle pieces. Like each person is a puzzle piece. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a matter of like finding two pieces that match, but like imagine if you had the power to shape shift. Like you're a piece of the puzzle, you can shape shift. Yeah? Your aim is to click into place. You want to click into place with the other person. And when you do, that's like, that symbolizes like change. Yeah? You've changed something in them, something's clicked, they get it.
Mm-hmm.
To do that, to shape shift into that, the piece that fits them, you have to find out what their piece looks like. And that's like hidden from you. And the only way to access it is through curiosity, empathy, questions, openness, all that kind of stuff. And it's only then that you can then like do the shape-shifty thing, click, and then activate change. And it might not happen all at once. You might fit like one spot, but then like the other knob is like sticking out, whereas for them it's sticking out as well. So then it doesn't fit and it sits on top of the other. And, you know, so it takes a few attempts.
It's interesting because it's leading by example. Like the change that we want to create is based on empathy. It is based on community. It is based on coming together and being more functional and empowering. And it's interesting that the only way to create such change is to do that in the process. Hold up. Don't go anywhere, because we want to hear from you. Have you had a new thought, realization, or perspective shift during this episode? Tell us about it.
Wherever you're listening from, this conversation is just getting started. Head to the comments section of this episode, the link is in the description, or if you're listening on YouTube, just scroll down and share your insights with us. Be sure to include the timestamps so we know the part that spoke to you.
This podcast is here to spark broader conversation, and the fun part for us is exploring it with you.
Because when we pull our minds together, we're not so fucked after all.